Okay, so this is a continuation of the lecture for Chapter 1. This is the second part of the lecture. And I'm doing some practice recordings and also making backup recording in case the classroom lecture somehow doesn't take the first day or two. And so a lot of these, this part of the lecture will seem kind of funny because I will be using the students in the class who are not present right now for these recordings to answer questions about their reading or for prompting discussion. And so because there's nobody here to discuss this with, I'm just going to be presenting the basic flow of the lecture. Okay, and so I want to save this first here. Let's see here. That's interesting. I guess I'll do that later. Okay, I'm going to go ahead with this. I'm going to add a page. So this is a continuation of the previous discussion. So having talked some about certainty, we need to ask the question about how are we going to be able to proceed? We have to begin someplace. And as I said, we begin obviously by acknowledging our reliance on our senses. The senses are ultimately the final arbiters of anything. That any of our ideas in our mind, we have to test them against the real world. And the only way that we can do that is to use our senses. In one way or another, even if we do experiments that involve extensions of our senses through microscopes or telescopes or other sensors of some kind, ultimately we know about the results of those and what they mean. Well, we know about the results of those through use of our senses, and our intellect is required in order to understand the meaning of those things. So, obviously, that's the place we begin, with our sense knowledge. And we're talking about something really very primitive here. What is our knowledge of the physical world? What are the simple things that we know? So, in the text, Dr. Rizzi talks about 5 first principles of physics. That is the place where physics begins. That is the first understanding that we form of the physical world can be reduced to 5 simple first principles. So these are, as I said, the first principles of physics. That is the understanding of the physical world, the changeable world. As we said, physical things are something and can be something else. Okay, now it's important here, these are a little bit like, these are the things we are most certain of in the physical world, in our knowledge of the physical world. And I would like to make an analogy, although it's a weak analogy, but it helps to illustrate what we mean by these principles. Principle meaning something from which other things come, and the first principles meaning that these are the beginning of the study of physics, beginning of our knowledge of the physical world, the first general things that we can say. We've got lots of specific things that we see in the world. We see lots of particular physical things. But what are the things that we can say that's true about all of the physical things? So in some sense, it's a little bit like an analogy to grammar, in that you begin with some understanding of language and how language functions, and that's how you build up your understanding of language, and the principles of grammar then would be the place that you begin with the study of grammar. You would have the principles of grammar. So you would say, words, nouns and verbs and adjectives, those sorts of things, or types of words. So these are the things that you would presume in the study of grammar. So that's a weak analogy, though, but it's not bad in the sense that what we're looking for is something like that. But it's actually even more fundamental because, as we said, physics is the base science. It's the base knowing. It's how we know everything in the world. The other thing that I want to, before I even write the principles down, these are not axioms, even though they're going to maybe seem like that. And that's because we're used to talking about axioms in mathematical systems. Instead, these are a general understanding of the way that nature is. Axioms can be changed. You can posit some axioms about a mathematical system and say, well, what if I change the axioms? You could talk about the same thing in the game of chess. What if I change the rules of chess? And I said, the knight moves in a different way. The pawns move in a different way. I had different pieces. I just call them even, and they're just different. Change the shape of the board. You could do these things arbitrarily, make a new game. It might be a better game. It might be a worse game. I don't know, but it would be a different game. We don't have the choice in this subject. We can't change these rules. These are not things that are arbitrarily dictated by the mind. Rather, they are given to us by virtue of living in this world. So they have to do with the world around us. And so these are the most general things that you can say about physical things, the physical world. So the first thing, and it's going to sound a bit goofy because it's so primitive. These are primitive beginnings because we are going from the base science. And so we do have to begin with the most primitive. And so the first thing that you can say about the physical world, the first thing which cannot be proven, it must be the beginning of our study of physics, is the understanding that things exist. It would be absurd to try to prove this. Not only that, but how would you begin to prove something like this? You would have to presume this in order to begin a proof that things exist. It's not something really that can be proven. It is only something that can be experienced and shared by those of us who live in the world. So you presume this when we do physics. We presume that things exist. And it's only provable in the sense that it's something that the human mind understands. After you live in the world, you understand things exist. And almost immediately, I think, that you might come to an understanding that, hey, there's stuff out there. The next thing you realize is that they change. They don't always change. They're not constantly changing, but they do change. Something that's small becomes big. Something that's big becomes small. Something moves from here to there. Something changes color. Something changes texture. Some things go out of existence. They stop existing. Or maybe they just go out of range of our senses, or maybe they really do just stop existing. Some things come into existence that didn't exist before. So this is really the beginning of science. This is really the beginning of physics, not Newton's equations or Newton's laws, not the Schrodinger equation, not string theory, not the general theory of relativity. Those things are not the first principles of physics. In fact, all of those more specific, elevated, abstract theories depend on these first principles. So, and I wonder, in fact, if any of you have ever heard of these principles enunciated this way. Okay. In fact, I seriously doubt it. The third principle, general thing that we can say about all of stuff around us, is called the principle of non-contradiction. And those who have read the text will understand this, will remember this. The principle of non-contradiction is that something cannot both be and not be in the same way at the same time. Okay, that's the principle of non-contradiction. It's the basis, as I said, of our understanding of the physical world. It's one of those things that we understand almost as fundamental as that things exist and things change. That we all know to be true. And I cannot prove it. Although if I tried to disprove this principle, in fact, I would find out that I would actually have to use it. and trying to construct a proof. And therefore, any attempt to try to disprove this would be itself self-contradictory. That is logically absurd. So, in fact, this is one of the things that we know to be true. We are most certain of these basic principles of the physical world. The next one is the principle of causality. Something cannot change itself. Whatever is changed by another. That's another way of saying it. We're going to talk about this principle of causality some more. He talks about this in the text as well. When you're first hearing these basic principles, it's best just to think of them in a simple way, in a childlike way, in the sense that they are so fundamental. These are things that you encountered when you were a child. These are some of the first things that you came to know, even if you didn't understand these things explicitly. You didn't think at 3 years old, oh, now I understand the principle of non-contradiction. It's not something that works like that. You know them in an ill-formed way, in a confused way. And maybe, in fact, this is the first time that you've heard expression of them in a clear way and are starting now to come to grips with what they mean. It's possible. But you know them, just not in a scientific way. Not in a way which expresses it clearly and is easily understood to be true. In fact, these things, you cannot really conceive of their converses. The converses of these are obviously inconceivable. Okay, now the last principle has to do with the mode of existence of things. And it's not stated simply in simple words. I think he has about a paragraph. And that is, things exist in one of two modes. When we talk about that something exists, we mean it in one of two ways. It's either as a substance or as a property of a substance. So when I say, take some simple declarative sentences that have scientific meaning. This tablet is here. Some specific thing is someplace. So that's a simple declarative sentence that refers to something, the thing being this. A better example would be a person. That person is sitting there. That's a better one. Let me take a thing like that, and I'll explain why I'm taking that instead of the tablet in a minute. So I have a person sitting there in the chair. That person is there. That person has dark hair. Is another example. So in that case, I have a subject of the sentence, which in this case is also presumed to be the subject of existence. The thing exists as a thing, a separate thing of its own. And that's what a substance is. A substance exists of its own. It exists of itself. By contrast, I can talk about properties of a substance. And a property of that person is what I mentioned. Dark hair. That person has dark hair. That person is there. That's a property of a thing. Location is a property of the substance. So we're going to talk about properties. Let's see. In a minute. But first let's talk some more about this distinction between substance and property. We're going to describe properties in some great detail, and we're going to leave substances described only in very broad terms at the moment. We're going to talk about them in very generic terms. Properties we'll be a little bit more specific about and concrete. So, one thing that you notice about substances, things that exist of themselves. So I should write down property here as property exists of another, exists of a substance. So let's give an example of a property just to be a little bit, so we can talk about it more. Color, for example, brown hair. Color is a property of the thing. Now you don't see the color existing separately. You don't see brown walking around down the hall. That's because the property exists of something. So, but we do say the property exists. It is an existing, something that does exist in a way, but it doesn't exist of itself. It exists of another. It exists of a substance. So, substance is something that exists of itself. How are we doing on time? Okay. All right, so let's give a few examples based on what little I've told you here. Substances, properties. And I'll ask the class at this point to give a few examples. I'll give them here in the lecture for you. Now, it's important when discussing substances, when you're learning about substances, first off, to talk about natural substances, not artificial ones. And the distinction is an artificial substance or an artificial thing is something that has been made by man. So that's why I chose, I corrected myself. I don't want to talk about notepads. I don't want to talk about computers and clocks and remotes and pencils and tables and chairs. In fact, almost everything in this room is an artifact. We surround ourselves with artifacts. There aren't very many things that aren't artifacts. Let's see, the water in this bottle. So that's a natural substance. So, water. A person. So these are natural substances, and I want to talk initially about natural substances. We will come to a discussion of artificial things and what they are exactly, how do they fit in. They're not properties, but they're not substances primarily speaking. We'll have to come to a better understanding. We're going to do that in Chapter 1, don't worry. But initially, when you're learning about the subject of substance, it's best to concentrate on natural substances first, because and you'll see why. So because we're talking about the natural world. So let's talk about these substances as a primarily natural substances as the primary example of substances now, for the purposes of understanding. Water, person, air, wood. Gold. Okay, now you don't actually know these things directly. You don't have any sense that tells you, that senses water specifically, that's water. Instead, what you do, I give you something that's clear and liquid. How do you find out what that is? And it's a natural question. What is that? You know, I hand it to somebody, and I tell me what that is. And I don't mean the bottle. Remember, that's an artificial thing. This water is held inside of an artifact. I'm talking about the water inside. Okay. So I hand this to you. What is it? Well, if you don't know what it is, it might be risky to do what I just did. But that's one way of finding out. You use your senses. You taste it. You feel it. Put your finger in there. It's liquid. It's clear. You use your senses, and you can continue using your senses to find out how heavy it is, all of these things. You keep investigating it, and at some point you say, that's water, right? Now, that's not your first encounter with water, but that is how you would determine water. So now what you just did, though, in all of those things, let's go back and look at that. There were the properties. So it was tasteless. So taste, color, feel, so texture. You could use sounds of different kinds. So these are generic properties. we could be more specific.